Okay, so I think we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. Those in Asia, good morning. Those in Europe and Africa, and maybe good evening to or good night to those in the Americas. So welcome to the Integrative Conservation webinar series for May 2024. Today we have a very exciting presentation by Professor Hua Fangyuan. But before we go into speaker, let me just give a few housekeeping notes about these webinars. So can we have the next slide, please? Just a reminder that this webinar series is part of the activities of Integrative Conservation, which is a relatively new journal that the Sichuan Tropical Botanical Garden launched in 2022. And Integrative Conservation is a generalist journal on biodiversity conservation. We publish different format of articles of any kind of discipline relevant for biodiversity conservation, being a theory, practice, or policy. We just published recently our March issue, so then you can go online to see our papers. And can we have our next slide, please? We have also special issues. Here are two special issues that we have open calls for papers. One is on snow leopard conservation, and the other one is on nature education or environmental education. If you are interested in gestating a special issue or you have any suggestion for special issues, please contact us. We'll be happy to discuss with you and try to think of an interesting special issue. Next slide, please. So if you want to access our website, you can use this QR code and you will see our papers. Just mention that the Integrative Conservation is open access and is free to publish unless until the end of 2025. So then we are very keen on getting papers from this audience. Next, please. Today's webinar is part of our monthly webinar series. Every month we have an outstanding speaker talking about different aspects of biodiversity conservation. Our webinars are normally the first Tuesday of every month, but sometimes we have special events, like in this case on May 21st, we'll have a special webinar by Professor Jeffrey Sachs. I guess the audience will be familiar with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. He was the mastermind of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. And he's a professor in Columbia, has been the chief economist in UN, special advisor for UN Secretary General from 2001 to 2018. And he has a long list of merits. So then in this case, this was a special request. We asked Professor Jeffrey Sachs if he could discuss about the link between the Sustainable Development Goals, as you know, it's a very big global policy agenda, and the interaction with the Global Biodiversity Framework that, you know, was agreed upon in 2022, how these two big agendas can synergize and also potential conflicts between them. So this will be a special webinar, and it will take place on Tuesday, 21st of May, 9 a.m. Beijing time. So this will not be our usual afternoon time. This will be at 9 a.m. And then next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? Yeah. And our next regular webinar will be by Professor William Sutherland from Cambridge University. I think Bill Sutherland doesn't need much of an introduction in the conservation community. He will be talking about evidence-based conservation. He was the father of bringing evidence conservation into conservation biology. Coming from this was an idea that came from medicine, and he will be giving some ideas on how the impact that evidence-based conservation has had in conservation initiatives and different aspects of this approach. This will be on the 4th of June at 4:30 p.m. Beijing time and morning time in Europe and Africa, and of course late evening in the Americas. Again, if our audience, we have a very broad audience for these webinars. The presentations are normally recorded and they are posted on YouTube or Bilibili. So then for you in the audience, if you have any idea of anyone you would like to hear, you would like to see giving a presentation, or there's any topic that you would like to see covered, you can just contact us and we will try to accommodate your request. So then let's go to the next slide, please. So this is our presentation for today. We have an outstanding young scholar, Hua Fangyuan. I hope I'm pronouncing well. I know I'm terrible with the tones. And Fangyuan is going to talk about biodiversity conservation under deforestation and forest restoration, understanding impacts and identifying solutions. Fangyuan is assistant professor is a conservation ecologist at Peking University, and she works on research that is actually quite useful compared with many other research lines. I think her work is very practical and has very clear applications for effective conservation and restoration. She did her PhD at the University of Florida, and she did postdoctoral fellowships in Princeton and Cambridge before coming back to China as assistant professor in Peking University. So then, without any further ado, Fangyuan, you can share your slides. And so Fangyuan will talk for around 45 minutes. And after that, we will have a Q&A session for around 35, 40 minutes. The audience, we have people in two different platforms today. We have people watching us on Zoom, and we have people following us on CoShare. If you want to make any question, please just drop your question on the chat box in either of these platforms, and we will convey the questions to the speaker. So yeah, Professor Hua, all yours.
Thank you, Ahimsa, for the kind introduction. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well. We can see the slides. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak here. I just wanted to say that I'm a fan of your webinar series, and such a wonderful lineup of speakers coming up. So that's really exciting. So today, I'm hoping to share some of my research on the issue of land use change involving forest ecosystems. So here's an image showing inferred human modification of the Earth's land surface over a very long time span. So it's clear from this image that human modifications of the Earth's terrestrial land surface has been very profound and over a very long history. And this is the reason why it's not surprising that habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation because of human land use change are regarded as among the biggest threats to global biodiversity. So today for my talk, I would like to share two strands of research that my lab has been doing on the issue of deforestation, as well as on a more positive note, the issue of forest restoration. More specifically, for the issue of deforestation, I'm going to talk a little bit about a particular study, a specific study on the impacts of agricultural deforestation on biodiversity. So the conservation relevance of agriculture is obvious. It is the world's single largest land use. Not only does it occupy a big share of the world's terrestrial land surface, but it's also a major, prominent, ongoing agent of land use change globally. Specifically regarding forest ecosystems, we know that agriculture has been a major driver for deforestation around the world, but particularly in the tropics. Existing evidence points to pretty severe biodiversity impacts of agricultural deforestation. But it's also clear from this influential synthesis that even for studies looking at agricultural deforestation's impact on biodiversity, there seems to be a pretty wide variation in terms of how severe such impacts are. This indication is supported by the results of some empirical studies on birds in particular. So here I'm providing some examples of 3 empirical studies done in the field, looking at how avian communities respond to agricultural deforestation. And they have reached pretty different conclusions in terms of how severe such impacts are, from quite severe in terms of impacts to more neutral impacts, or even in some systems, more positive impacts. The reason underlying the potential variation in how severely biodiversity responds to agricultural deforestation has, of course, obvious ecological interest, but it is also, I would argue, of a high conservation significance. And the reason for this is that it's underlying our effort to look for potential interventions to try to manage the negative biodiversity impacts of agricultural deforestation. So up until now, prevailing research or prevailing thoughts have attributed the potential reasons for such observed variations in how biodiversity responds to agricultural deforestation to mainly the features of agricultural systems, specifically how diverse or heterogeneous the landscapes are in terms of having forest cover or other non-agricultural habitat elements, but also in terms of the intensity of agricultural practices like fertilizer use or the degree of mechanization. But, and actually such understanding has been the cornerstone of a lot of our current efforts to try to manage the negative impacts of agricultural deforestation on biodiversity, such as the famous EU's agroecology scheme, trying to manage the landscape features and also intensity of practices. But is such reason the only reason or the whole answer to this question of potential reasons for the variation in such impacts? And here, the one question we posed is that might there be inherent geographical variations in terms of how sensitive or how tolerant biodiversity of a given region inherently is to agricultural deforestation, such that agricultural features aside, biodiversity of different regions, they may be inherently different in terms of how sensitive they may be to the same level of agricultural deforestation. So there's actually some pretty compelling theoretical reasons why such a question may be posed. Here I'm showing a figure of the global map, of course, showing the variation in some environmental conditions to show that there's actually quite considerable global variation in, for example, seasonality, the natural conditions of seasonality, but also human agricultural history. And I'm linking in a concept called filtering, which is arguably a familiar concept in community ecology. And the theoretical reason here goes like this. These environmental conditions, they may have been serving as a filter to select for species for a given region, such that in terms of their inherent sensitivity to agricultural deforestation, species may differ and regions may differ in the local assemblages in terms of how sensitive they may be. So to illustrate this point, I'll give first maybe a more intuitive example. So here, this map shows the route by which the global agricultural centers have developed over time. And here is an image from a pretty famous study showing the extinction patterns of mammal species in North America. So what this study shows is that the extinction rate of mammal species has a high correlation with the time by which humans arrived on the North American continent. And this phenomena actually has been supported by ample evidence from across the world, showing that humans have caused species extinctions in a highly selective way, such that essentially humans, their modifications of the environment essentially act like an extinction filter to select for species. So in the context of agricultural deforestation, it is conceivable that human modifications or human presence or human agricultural history in the region might have selected for species such that those sensitive species, they might have gone extinct already for regions with a long agricultural history, or they may have otherwise adapted. In contrast, regions with a short or no previous agricultural history, there may have been more species that may be sensitive to agriculture left, simply because they have not yet passed through this filter of extinction caused by humans. Now, on the other hand, when we look at some biophysical conditions, like, for example, seasonality, they may also, there may also be theoretical reasons to expect that they may act as habitat filters. And this is closely related to the concept of habitat or environmental filtering in community ecology. To illustrate this point, here I have provided two images of native forest ecosystems in different parts of China. One from northeastern China showing the birch, deciduous broadleaf birch forest. The other from southwestern China with evergreen broadleaf forest. So we can tell both images were taken in the winter, and we can see from the images that the forest ecosystems here, they differ quite a lot in terms of their seasonality. For the forest in Northeast, they actually annually they go through leafing and defoliation cycles. Such that here we see trees with basically no leaves, and in the summer they would grow leaves to become more like a forest. Whereas in the southwestern side, the native forests there, they tend to be with leaves on all year round. So because of this structural differences, and if you agree with me that the forests in northeastern China, they right now in the winter, they have more resemblance to habitats without forest or deforested habitat in terms of having more open vegetation structure, and kind of more akin to land without forest cover, then presumably it's conceivable that species in the northeastern forest ecosystem compared to the southwestern system, they may have been more pre-adapted to agricultural deforestation simply because they have been more naturally exposed to non-forest-like habitat conditions. So in other words, given the existing or known geographical variations in terms of some biophysical factors, as well as human agricultural history, there is theoretical reason to expect that potentially regions may differ in terms of how filtered their species may have been because of these factors, natural as well as anthropogenic. So that species that are left today for us to study the impacts of agricultural deforestation on, they may have already differed in terms of how inherently sensitive they may be. So this kind of possibility that I just explained was from theoretical perspective. And actually, so far, we have not yet had a global study to test that possibility. But there are some interesting empirical studies to provide some empirical hints that such a possibility might exist. So here I'm showing two studies. The one on the left is a field study coming from India, done in the southern Himalayas. So the authors, what they did was they were looking at the impacts of deforestation by agriculture on forest birds. And they did surveys in two study sites that differed in the extent of seasonality. So in the eastern Himalayas, the seasonality is pretty low. In the western Himalayas, the seasonality is pretty high in terms of annual temperature change. And for each site, they conducted surveys of bird communities in the agricultural landscape as well as in the forest ecosystem. So in the eastern site, what they found was agricultural landscape supported significantly less or fewer bird species compared to native forest. And this is for the site that had lower levels of seasonality. Whereas in the western site with higher levels of seasonality, the result was completely flipped, with agricultural landscape supporting significantly higher species richness compared to native forest ecosystems. Another study is a global synthesis. It's again for the impacts of impacts on biodiversity caused by land use change, but it's for a slightly different context of forest fragmentation. So what the authors did was they compiled a global database on species level abundance response to forest fragmentation. And they were trying to look into the reasons or patterns of how different such responses may be. And what they found was that when they divided the study systems into low disturbance versus high disturbance ecosystems, they found that species assemblages in the lower disturbance ecosystems, they tend to have a higher proportion of species that are vulnerable to the impacts of fragmentation. So basically showing that in ecosystems with low disturbance levels, bird species there, they tend to be more sensitive to forest fragmentation. So these results, they are both actually consistent with what I just now explained in terms of theoretical explanations or predictions, that filtering factors, they may have selected for species in ways different across regions of the world to render different inherent levels of sensitivity of current assemblages to agricultural deforestation. So under this context, we set out to do a global synthesis, a multi-layered study trying to address the possibility that there might be some inherent differences in terms of how sensitive species assemblages are to agricultural deforestation, aside from the features of agricultural systems. So for the first part of the study, we compiled a global database of species-level abundance data for matching agriculture and native forest pairs for whole species assemblages. With this data, we were able to calculate for each species the response ratio in terms of how abundant the abundance ratio between the same species between agriculture and forest to calculate a metric for their response. And then with all the species within the community or assemblage, we were able to calculate an assemblage level metric. And then we also compiled data on features of agricultural systems because previous studies have indicated that this is an important part of the explanatory variable. But then, of course, we compiled data on four factors of filters to try to assess if the observed differences in species responses may have been explained by filters as well. I should also note that we limited our study to birds. The purpose of doing this is to avoid introducing potential variation linked to different responses by different taxa, so that we at least limit our study scope to birds, the same taxa that may be expected to have more similar responses. Now, to further deliver the point of, or the test of the filtering effect home, we conducted a second part of the study to test whether there would be, or there was a signature of filtering on species functional traits. And this was because conceptually, if filtering was indeed operating on the current species assemblages, we would expect that the filtering effect would be operating on species functional traits in terms of their morphology, their ecological features, and also their life history traits. So for this aspect, we compiled from existing databases 10 traits for each of the 3,000 plus species that we have compiled in the previous database. So the effort of quite a lot of data compilation turned out to have generated a global database of 71 avian assemblages from 44 studies in 25 countries. And I should note that one reason why the data compilation effort was quite arduous was because, as you can imagine, species level abundance data for entire avian assemblages were pretty difficult to obtain because most studies, or many studies, they would not really provide such detailed table in their online supplements. So we had to reach out to the individual authors of primary studies to request their collaboration to join this study. So this database, in the end, it actually accounted for about 72% of all the studies we were able to locate by systematic literature search. So it's a reasonable database, and it spanned a wide range of the several filtering variables. Here, maybe I should just add a note that the reason why we considered agricultural history, I have explained that already, and seasonality already. But in terms of rainfall and disturbance regime, the idea of including them as potential natural filtering variables is basically the same as seasonality in the sense that in regions with lower rainfall, we would expect natural forest ecosystems to have a more open canopy forest structure, which with an more open canopy, that's a feature that potentially resembles deforested habitat more. So we were expecting that the natural variable of rainfall, a lack of rainfall, may render a natural forest ecosystem to more resemble a deforested habitat, therefore applying a filtering effect. And similarly for disturbance, if a system has recurrently or repeatedly gone through disturbance regime, then presumably species assemblages there, they would be more pre-adapted to habitat disturbances, including agricultural deforestation. So to answer the first question, we first did a simple meta-analysis, and the results here show that indeed there's actually a fairly substantial geographical variation among assemblages, with each dot representing the result of an assemblage in terms of their response ratio. And values to the left of 0 would indicate negative impacts of agricultural deforestation, whereas those to the right would indicate positive impacts. And a further look revealed that the apparent positive impacts on many assemblages, as shown in the figure to the left, were actually because of incoming winter species, in the sense that if we remove species in the assemblage that have not been recorded in native forest baselines, then the result would actually all basically change to the left of 0. So so what I mean here is that the figure to the left actually used all data for all species within a given assemblage, whereas the figure to the right has retained only species that have been recorded in the baseline of native forest. So we have essentially removed winter species that have come in that did not belong in the native forest habitats before the deforestation. But it should be noted that even after this analysis, the apparent geographical variation still persists. So the next step was to do a meta-regression, trying to look at how the extent to which assemblage level response ratio would be related to potential explanatory variables. And here what we found was that consistent with previous studies, we did find that agricultural, the features of agricultural systems, they matter a lot, in the sense that in study systems with more tree cover, remnant tree cover, the bird assemblage responses tend to be less negative. So this supports previous understanding of the importance of managing the features of agricultural landscapes. But more strikingly, what we found was also that the filtering variables of rainfall, as well as agricultural history, explained the assemblage level response ratio in a way that's consistent with theoretical predictions. So that in systems with lower rainfall, as here to the more left of the x-axis, and in systems with longer agricultural histories, we tend to see assemblages showing less negative impacts of agricultural deforestation. And this is consistent with what our theory would predict. And then to further test the signature of filtering on species functional traits to really bring the story home, what we did was we first did a species level analysis looking at how the 10 functional traits might explain species response to agricultural deforestation. And this analysis gave a very clear pattern of what a loser species, so to speak, in other words, a species that's sensitive to agricultural deforestation, such species might look like. Here I call loser species syndrome. So in short, what we found was that species that tend to be more sensitive to agricultural deforestation, they tend to have larger body mass, they tend to be more specialized in their diet, they tend to forage at a higher height. They also tend to have a stronger dependence on forest ecosystems for habitat use and nesting. And they also tend to have greater generation length, meaning they're slower. They're in terms of life history, they're the more kind of slower species. And at the same time, these loser species, they also tend to have a smaller handling index, which is usually used as an index for a dispersal capability. They also tend to be sedentary or resident instead of migratory. They also tend to have smaller range sizes and clutch sizes. So in other words, our analysis has painted a loser species syndrome. Now, what really can eventually or finally deliver the story of filtering home is the next analysis. So now that we know what a loser species would look like in terms of its traits, the story of filtering would only be complete if we can show or we can find that in systems that tend to have more negative impacts of agriculture on avian assemblages there, they also tend to have more loser syndromes. So this is exactly what we found. We found that for assemblages under higher rainfall, lower seasonality, and shorter agricultural histories, if you remember from the previous slide, these features of the filtering factors, they would correspond to more sensitive species or more sensitive biodiversity to agricultural deforestation. Assemblages in these regions, they also tend to have stronger loser syndromes. So with these analyses, what we can conclude now is that in addition to the features of agricultural landscape, or the agricultural systems, we found inherent variations among the world's regions in terms of how sensitive extant biodiversity is to current deforestation. And this is beyond features of the agricultural systems per se. And a worrying issue is that we know that global agriculture continues to expand and maybe even shift among different regions. There is a study that I cited here that has projected the map here, showing the projected expansion of agriculture globally. And we can see that some of the hotspots for future agricultural expansion, they tend to be in tropical regions, in regions of lower seasonality and high rainfall, and also short agricultural histories. These regions, they, based on our study, they tend to have features, or they tend to have gone through filtering in a way that renders their existing biodiversity potentially more sensitive to agricultural deforestation. This would indicate that for the future expansion of agriculture, the predicted impacts yet to come on existing biodiversity might even be more severe, because up until now, agriculture has mostly happened already in the more filtered regions. And our study also brings into focus the importance of considering land use planning in terms of managing the world's the impacts of the global agriculture on biodiversity. Because if the explanatory variable, or if the reason for observed variations in the impacts of agricultural deforestation are only to do with the features of agricultural landscapes or agricultural systems, then managing the features of those systems would be our only or main tool that's necessary. But now that we found regions have inherent differences in how sensitive they are, how vulnerable they inherently are, then this really highlights the necessity of thinking about proactive planning of land use to try to avoid more sensitive regions. And the final point is that I think personally a striking finding for me is that we have indications now that some of the systems with longer agricultural histories, they have been more filtered by humans. Their extant bird species, they tend to be more tolerant of agricultural deforestation, which possibly indicates that some of the more sensitive species might have gone extinct. And this really highlights the moral responsibility of humans to try to lessen our future legacy on the world's intact ecosystems. So this is the first part on the topic of deforestation. And next, I will talk a little bit about some of our work on the issue of achieving biodiversity gains under forest restoration. And for this part, I'm going to briefly cover 3 points in terms of what type of forest to restore, what kind of biodiversity are we talking about when we talk about forest restoration to benefit, and then at what spatial scale we should be thinking about planning forest restoration at. So the first issue of what forests to restore essentially gets at the problem that not all forests are equal, or all forests are not equal. Not anything that's tree cover is a forest. And this gets to the issue of the sidelining of biodiversity in plantation-dominated forest restoration. So this topic essentially has to do with the fact that even though now globally we're talking about upscaling forest restoration, oftentimes, the motivation for restoration initiatives, they're really not about biodiversity per se, or the restoration of native ecosystems per se. Rather, oftentimes, the restoration initiatives are driven by more utilitarian goals, such as to do with water provisioning or carbon storage, or in the case of these 2 images showing Saihanba and the Green for Green project in Sichuan, that the goal may oftentimes be to do with soil erosion control. And under the current discussions about climate change mitigation, carbon farming may also be a looming motivation for a lot of the forest restoration programs. But the problem of this is that in these forms of restored tree cover, so to speak, because they take the form of plantations, biodiversity may not necessarily benefit and sometimes may even be harmed by the simple stand structure of these simple tree covers. So to try to avoid and steer away from this problem, I think 2 things are important to consider. One is when we think about the root of this issue, one is that, like I just mentioned, oftentimes the motivation or the motivation for these restoration initiatives may be to do with functionality goals or utilitarian goals rather than biodiversity itself. And then there's often the assumption that any kind of tree cover will do in terms of delivering these functionality goals. And this is really the crux of the issue when we think about the problem of biodiversity being sidelined. So to try to provide some scientific insights to enable the placing back of biodiversity into the benefit space of forest restoration, me and my colleagues did a global meta-analysis of comparison between the performance of plantations in 4 important ecosystem services as well as biodiversity relative to that of native forests. So in simple terms, what we did was we compared plantations with old growth forest or forests that have never been deforested before in terms of biodiversity, carbon storage, soil erosion control, and water provisioning services. We also did a similar comparison of plantations against abandoned plantations, meaning plantations that are fairly old or that are no longer actively managed for timber production, against the native forest baseline that I just described. What we also did was we compared the performance of plantations against their similar aged native forest that has been restored, meaning both forms of forest are the result of restoration. So we're no longer comparing plantations against an ideal benchmark. Overall, what we showed was that in terms of the environmental goals assessed, there's actually no trade-off between the other ecosystem service goals versus biodiversity, in that all of the ecosystem service goals of an environmental nature, carbon storage, soil erosion control, and water provisioning, they all benefit more from the restoration of native forest in the same way as biodiversity. And actually, soil erosion control may have even shown the biggest shortfall between plantations versus native forest benchmarks. But there is a trade-off as well. In terms of wood production, we have more to gain from high-yielding plantations relative to the restoration of native forests. So this really highlights the potential challenge of a trade-off between environmental and production goals under forest restoration. And this points to 2 possible solutions. One is to think about what our goal is when we design forest restoration. So even if our goal is not about biodiversity conservation, when we talk about the storage of carbon or soil erosion control or hydrological provisioning, our research shows that native forest restoration would be the best answer for these environmental goals. But on the other hand, if the goal is about timber production, then policymakers have real trade-offs to navigate to try to reconcile the potential trade-off. The second issue under the topic of forest restoration is about what species are we talking about when we talk about biodiversity benefits under forest restoration. And here, the key of the issue is the fact that not all species are equal when we talk about managing our land. So here, this image to the left of the figure you have already seen, it's basically an analysis of birds' tolerance of agricultural deforestation related to their traits. And this study is a new fairly new paper that came out last year in Nature Ecology and Evolution. What the authors did was they analyzed birds' sensitivity to fragmentation in relation to their dispersal ability. The point here is that we see from repeated studies that species tolerance of forest loss and degradation in various forms, they are related to their ecological, morphological, or even life history traits. And this brings in the issue of the topic of winners and losers. So here I'm providing two species in southern China as an example. We know that in any given forest ecosystem, if it well, I guess a caveat is it has not been terribly filtered by anthropogenic extinction. We would tend to see some species that are more or less still vulnerable to human modification of the natural habitat. In this case, illustrated by a flycatcher species that relies on native forest for their habitat. But at the same time, we also tend to have species that may thrive and benefit from human modification of natural habitat. In this case, the red-whiskered bulbul, that we know is a very widespread species in heavily modified habitats. So the species on the left would be considered a loser, because it tends to be harmed in the process of human modifications of the natural environment. Whereas the bulbul here represents a whole suite of species that might be considered winners. Now, the point here I want to make is that when we talk about forest restoration, not all species automatically benefit. For some of the loser species, because they require large and mature forest for their natural habitat, they're unlikely to benefit from any kind of forest restoration unless the restoration really thinks about eventually restoring large expanses of connected and mature forest. So with this in mind, I would like to highlight two issues two approaches of restoration that have been now much discussed in terms of benefiting biodiversity. One is mixed culture plantation. I know that in China, at least, the policymakers are in the process of diversifying China's monoculture plantation landscape with the rationale that a mixed culture landscape would benefit biodiversity more while providing maybe even more ecosystem services. And as shown here by the result of a postdoc in my lab, Dr. Demeng Jiang, what he found was in the production landscape, plantation landscape in Guangxi province in China, if you convert monoculture plantations here shown in the bottom orange to mixed plantations shown here in blue, right on top of the orange band, we do see increases in species richness. So in other words, there are tangible benefits of bringing some species back into the landscape. But if you parse out what species occurs in what kind of forest cover in his study system, you will see that a lot of species, they are actually only found in the mature native forest in the protected areas in the region. So none of them would occur in the plantation landscape. So in other words, even though we see biodiversity benefits of mixed culture plantation, only a limited set of species would benefit. And there's still a large number of species that may not be able to benefit from this kind of plantation modification. And then, of course, the figure, this figure I have already shown you, the differences between analyzing the whole species assemblage as altogether, or looking at only the potential loser species. And we see that particularly with agroforestry, this is another restoration approach I'm highlighting here. We generally think that agroforestry, by putting in tree layers in agricultural landscapes, it may benefit biodiversity to a large extent in some systems even. So here we do see that for whole assemblages, the avian assemblage for agroforestry actually exceeds native forest benchmarks. But if we only look at loser species, then the result is completely flipped. In other words, this is showing us that for the loser species, agroforestry is unlikely to benefit many of them. So in other words, whereas mixed culture plantation and agroforestry as two restoration approaches that are increasingly being talked about, they can bring biodiversity benefits over monocultures and open agriculture. They are unlikely to benefit some of the more loser species that may depend on intact, mature forest ecosystems for their survival and ecological needs. And the apparent benefits brought by mixed culture plantations and agroforestry, they may mostly concern species that are anyway benefiting from human modifications of the landscape. So those that tend to be winner species anyway. And these species tend not to be of conservation concern. So the point I really want to make here for this issue is that restoration design should really make room for the restoration of large, connected, and mature forest ecosystems. Then the final issue concerns at what spatial scale we should be thinking about or look at when we try to plan forest restoration. And here the point I would like to make is that we should be conceptualizing and designing forest restoration at large spatial scales. So here I'm showing several images of different forms of forest restoration, whereas here in the corner, the upper left is an image of an old growth forest in Tibet, actually in Madok County in Tibet. The other 5 images, they're all for various forms of forest restoration. As you can see, natural regeneration, which relies on natural growth of the vegetation to naturally recover. Then we can also have assisted natural regeneration, which is restoration approach that's increasingly being picked up. The rationale here is humans can apply some assistance to the restoration site, such as preventing grazing, such as removing invasive species, to eventually allow natural regeneration processes to kick in. And then we have also another form, which is called biodiversity planting. And this is essentially tree planting, but of an intentionally highly diverse mix of native species, and potentially in a well thought out order, so that we can eventually bring back something akin to native forest ecosystems. Then, of course, we have what we are more familiar with, the simple tree planting, resulting in structurally simple tree plantations, and then the agroforestry I mentioned a moment ago. So there's been a lot of discussions about how much biodiversity benefit these different forms of restoration can bring. But what we noticed is that a lot of these discussions, or the vast majority of these discussions, are really focusing only on the land under restoration per se. But one thing I would like to point out is that any outcome in terms of, for example, biodiversity conservation, but also ecosystem services of forest restoration, they're actually subject to the influences of many larger scale factors outside of the land under restoration per se. And one obvious factor belongs to the field of landscape ecology. So we know from landscape ecology that there's a lot of landscape level factors that can affect the patterns and processes of biodiversity at the local scale. So we already have some evidence from the forest restoration field that landscape features such as the percentage of mature forest in the landscape, as well as distance from the restoration land parcel to mature forest, they heavily affect the speed with which biodiversity and other ecosystem services can recover. But a lesser noticed issue is the topic of potential offsite impacts of forest restoration. Here, I'm providing one example from a well-known study looking at Vietnam. We know that in the late 1990s, Vietnam has undergone large-scale forest restoration because of state policies. And a group of remote sensors and land use scientists, they found that if you compile data on the forest cover increase in Vietnam, as well as the amount of timber import at the same time from other countries, you will see that Vietnam's forest restoration has actually displaced a significant amount of deforestation overseas, particularly to Laos and Cambodia. But on the other hand, like I mentioned, plantations may potentially produce timber at a very high efficiency compared to native forest. So if we were able to produce large amounts of timber with high production efficiency, like high yielding plantations, presumably the land under restoration can presumably play a sparing role for land elsewhere that may otherwise be subject to the pressure of deforestation. A good example, although not direct example, is our own China's natural forest protection program, which has, as part of the program, has encouraged the establishment of fast-growing, high-yielding timber plantations. And many scholars actually believe that such a composite measure of, at the same time, protecting natural forests, but also establishing fast-growing timber plantations may have significantly alleviated pressure that China places on timber harvesting overseas. So the point here is really that when we talk about the outcome or the benefit of forest restoration, its impacts have to also account for potential offsite impacts it may have on sites outside of the restoration parcel per se. So here we did a very simple simulation to look at if we accounted for forest restoration outcomes only at the local parcel scale versus if we also accounted for potential offsite impacts mediated by timber production, then this kind of calculation would really flip or dramatically change the conclusion that you reach in terms of how effective the forest restoration has been in terms of environmental outcomes. So the point is, it would be crucial, given the landscape influences as well as potential offsite impacts, it would be crucial to integrate forest restoration into land use planning at large enough spatial scales, such that the landscape factors, as well as potential offsite impacts, these factors operating at larger spatial scales, they can all be accounted for, as well as managed or addressed, so that we can ensure the best overall outcome of forest restoration. So this brings us to the topic of how we can provide the science needed to guide such effective restoration design. And here, in a review piece that we have just published actually yesterday, we did a conceptual framework analysis or assessment of what kind of framework we should be thinking about when we talk about achieving the best outcomes of forest restoration in terms of biodiversity conservation as well as ecosystem services. So in terms of on-site outcomes, we propose that we need to have a better idea of how a range of forest restoration approaches can lead to biodiversity outcomes or other important ecosystem service outcomes. And importantly, such an assessment should be spatially explicit about potential landscape influences coming from the larger landscape. So for this purpose, we actually did a scanning of the literature, trying to just get a gauge of how mature the literature is in terms of meeting this calling. And what we found is that if we look at studies, in this case, we used a targeted search to try to identify the potential relevant literature that may meet the requirement that I just outlined here. So in other words, we did some simple targeted search with search terms. What we found is that if we look at studies that have addressed one restoration approach, there seems to be a lot of studies. The literature is huge. For some restoration approach, you can even have over 20,000 potential studies relevant. But as we increase the number of approaches that are covered in a given study to 2, 3, 4, or 5, we see increasingly fewer studies or smaller literature that actually potentially address this topic. Now, the caveat is we did not do a literature screening. All we did was to do a targeted search. But I think the numbers here, they provide a very coarse gauge, or crude gauge of how big the potential literature is. Now, similarly, when we look at one restoration outcome in terms of biodiversity or any kind of ecosystem service, or 2 outcomes, meaning a given study has to simultaneously cover 2 outcomes, 3 outcomes, 4 outcomes, or 5 outcomes, the size of the literature progressively got smaller. Now, in terms of literature that are focusing that potentially considers landscape effects on the outcome of forest restoration, panel D here shows the status of our current literature. What we see is that overall, as we put keywords representing landscape factors into the search, the size of the literature returned is dramatically smaller. And for some metrics of landscape factors, there's very limited literature, and overall the literature is not that big. So this really points us to the gap of current data and research focus on how much research effort we're putting into understanding the outcomes of different restoration approaches. I should also note that whereas tree planting has relatively a big literature in our research, restoration approaches like assisted natural regeneration has very limited research effort, as well as biodiversity planting. So this really points us to some existing glaring data gaps. Now, for an ideal methodological framework to guide restoration design, we also need to think about offsite impacts. And for this aspect, we actually need to know with high resolution where the displaced land potentially is. And in what format or what type of land cover that's affected offsite, because these would directly affect how much biodiversity and how much ecosystem services are affected by the offsite impacts. And then on top of that, this is only the land use aspect. Then we need to also translate this land use impact into the actual currency of biodiversity and other important metrics like ecosystem services. And we also did a quick assessment of the size of the literature. Overall, you can see that the size of existing literature looking at this topic is way limited compared to the on-site impacts. And actually, we only found 9 studies that addressed off-site impacts under forest restoration. And the vast majority of them, they only concerned land use, stopping short of translating such land use into the actual biodiversity or carbon or whatever ecosystem service outcomes. And actually, we did not find any study on how forest restoration may affect biodiversity offsite. And then, of course, there is also the limitation of how high a resolution we're able to relate offsite impacts to in terms of the land cover type that's actually affected. So in many studies, they would simply say displaced or offsite impact of forest restoration in the form of deforestation, or without indicating what kind of forest is being deforested. Now, a third component of a requisite framework would entail being able to realistically incorporate socio-political constraints of land use. So for example, land tenure, land use preference of local communities, and equity into a framework of land use planning. And for this, we found even a smaller literature on existing studies dealing with this topic. And finally, the framework needs to identify optimal restoration designs in terms of combining on-site as well as off-site impacts, and while considering socio-political constraints. And for optimization per se, actually, we know that methods now widely exist, but the challenge is really about the first 3 components. So to finally point at where we should go from here, we actually indicated or identified 2 existing frameworks that we can work off of to try to develop further to eventually arrive at an ideal framework. So these 2 existing frameworks are respectively land sharing sparing framework and also in the more land use science discipline, land use modeling. In simple terms, land sharing versus sparing tries to understand how to best reconcile production versus ecological gains by mapping out the relationship between species abundance and the land use intensity, and then conduct a land use simulation to try to calculate how much total biodiversity a given landscape or region can support. Whereas the land use modeling framework, initially they would generate different land use scenarios and then overlay that with different layers of data like biodiversity and ecosystem services to try to understand the outcomes of different land use scenarios, eventually to identify the optimal scenario. But based on our requirement of the requisite framework, both existing frameworks, they have notable shortfalls. But like I mentioned earlier, they actually provide a foundation upon which we can look to develop a more comprehensive framework. But this requires us to have more readily available methods, like, for example, the offsite impact tracking, as well as data, like, for example, the on-site outcome measurement. Only with these requisite methods and data would we be able to really advance the existing frameworks to truly arrive at a framework that is able to identify or tell us how to best design for forest restoration or other restoration at a large enough spatial scale to reach the best optimal biodiversity and ecosystem service outcome. So with that, I would like to finish today's talk. Hope I have not terribly run over time. The work I presented today, they are from a large group of collaborators and as well as students and postdocs in my lab. And here's an acknowledge and shout out to them. And also the work has been funded by various organizations and funding bodies. So it's also an acknowledgement. So with that, I'll stop here and Ahimsa, back to you.
Thank you, Fangyuan. It has been a fantastic presentation, and congratulations for the new paper. We just got fresh off the oven on the current biology paper. Yeah, as I said at the introduction, I think you are one of the people who do real useful work in conservation. I think we all want to be useful, but often we get lost in very theoretical issues or things that are not very implementable. And I think your work on restoration, conservation planning really is very useful for policy and for actual planning. Of course, the implementation will always be challenging, and I think that's something we can discuss a bit later. So for the audience, we have around 30 minutes of Q&A. If you want to make any question to Professor Hua, please type your question in the chat box, and we will read them. So then, from my side, I found very interesting the effect of scale, what you were saying about the looser species and winning species, and that really it made me think that really the land sparing option is going to have much bigger benefits in many cases than land sharing. I mean, if you can really put a lot of forest on one side and a lot of crops on the other side, would bring a lot of benefits. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think that's a really tricky question, a really good one, because obviously we know there's been long-running debates between the land sharing versus land sparing camp, and sometimes quite vicious debates. So I'm hesitant to really put a blanket yes or no answer there, but I think a key argument for the land sparing camp for its stronger benefits to biodiversity is precisely because of the loser species. The argument goes that unless any kind of agricultural landscape, so I should take a step back. When we talk about sharing sparing, oftentimes the conversation happens in the context of agricultural deforestation or agricultural conversion of natural habitat, right? So reconciling agriculture with nature conservation. And the argument is basically that any kind of agricultural landscape regardless of how friendly it is, the loser species, most of them, they cannot really survive there. They're just so sensitive that they can't use any of the so-called friendly structure in the landscape. And I think that holds true in a lot of places. But on the other hand, the land sharing camp, throws actually proposes a lot of very valid concerns about land sparing, in the sense that, I mean, there's a lot of criticisms. One major assumption of land sparing working is that by increasing yield on the given unit of land, you're able to actually lead to sparing of land. But we know from economics that oftentimes this does not happen. As you increase your production yield or production efficiency, there tends to be an economic effect where people want to invest more in expanding their production system. So that's a very real and practical concern. And at the same time, we also know that by increasing yield in the agricultural landscape, you may potentially lead to a lot of externality on land outside of the production landscape, and also the sustainability of agricultural landscapes per se. They may be in question as well. So I see valid arguments or valid points made by both sides. And of course, there's the kind of neutral ground saying, oh, what we need is sustainable intensification while doing land sparing. So I think I agree with a lot of scholars that ultimately the answer is probably multi-pronged. You don't really have one simple answer to this very complex issue of food production, driving the extinction of species. You may need to have effective land zoning, like for example, China has a very conscious national land zoning plan, or at least the framework is there. You also need to try to minimize or reduce your impact on site of the agricultural systems, try to increase the heterogeneity, try to lessen the intensity. But at the same time, you probably also need to think about reducing food demand, reducing our consumption density, like, with dietary shift and consumer behavior, all those multi-pronged approaches. But yeah, back to your question about loser species, I think the simple answer is yes. I think many species are so sensitive, they just can't handle any of the true agricultural landscape. That said, I have a hunch that different regions in the world, because of the filtering effect I was talking about, I think different regions may actually differ in terms of how they may be amenable to land sharing. But I think that's a really interesting question that needs to be tested.
Yeah. And a bit of, kind of on a different topic. It's not the one you presented today, but it's another paper that you were co-authored last year. I think it was with Bayer et al. In Communications, Nature Communications, one of the communications journal, about cropland relocation. And I thought that was, the results were very striking. The potential benefits on a theoretical exercise of just putting the crops wherever would be more optimized to whatever conservation objectives or the objectives. So I think those exercises are very eye-opening in terms of how many benefits could come from doing a bit more of planning of where to locate these things. So do you see any potential, maybe a country like China can have a policy that can really try to, of course, not 100% optimize, but optimize much more than currently to have more conservation benefits, ecosystem services benefits, other benefits?
That's a great question. And I think the short answer is yes. Because the whole reason why the Bayer's paper has such striking results is because we know land parcels in different parts of the world, they differ in their profile of how much biodiversity they can sustain in theory and how much ecosystem services they can provide in theory. Of course, this again it has a caveat of not really being explicit about the land cover type of a given pixel. It only looks at the potential. But with that, I think the geographical variation in terms of the land properties, I think yes. I think the short answer is yes. And there's been, other than the Bayer's paper, there's been some other studies, like, for example, the famous Strasbourg paper published initially in Nature Ecology Evolution, but then later another version, global version, published in Nature, trying to map out the restoration potential. I think these exercises, they provide broad guidance for us in terms of the point of the direction to go for. But again, I think conservation is always not it's not always, or it's always not just about in theory, right? Not about what can happen on paper. There's so much land use constraints and socioeconomic constraints, and I think the challenge is really about trying to follow the good science, but also try to integrate these other socio-political constraints into the land use planning. But yeah, I think I agree with your point that because like, for example, a simple example is we know food production in China has been shifting to northern China. In part because of the terrain being so flat and amenable to large machinery. And also, for example, the livestock industry, pig production has more and more being shifted toward factory style production. And I know that northern China has a lot of pigs being produced or being raised. So all these have large ramifications for the land resources. Whereas northern China, I don't know, this depends on the land potential of production. But another limitation or limit may be, for example, water. And northern China being so limited in water supplies, what's the ecological impact potentially of concentrating production in this region? I think these all need to be assessed in a systematic way, using the, I don't know, best data available, but also trying to look for more data and generate data to enable us to, answer those questions.
This is a fascinating topic, and I would like to make many questions. I will do only one more, and I will open to the floor. So the last question is about the future and thinking about not very short-term future, but talking about maybe 5 decades from now, 7 decades from now. So we are going to experience. I think it's going to be a very dynamic time, the decades ahead, and we're going to experience very important transitions. One is going to be big technological change. So and I guess that will affect things like agricultural efficiency, or maybe the capacity to transport water, or to have water in locations that are now water limited. And another important change is going to be demographic. So then many countries are going to be losing population. China might lose half of its population by the end of the century. And there's going to be also urbanization. So then there will be less people, and more of these people will be living in cities. That means a lot of space that can be used for other things. So are we taking into account these things? Is conservation biology thinking a bit ahead of the opportunities with these changes, or are these changes, not very positive? What is your view on this, on these perspectives?
Another great question. I think conservation biology is paying attention, and actually, for example, the topic of agricultural land abandonment. We know that there's been a series of studies looking into the conservation potential of agricultural land abandonment as populations move to the cities, as populations get more concentrated in the cities, and as agriculture becomes more concentrated in terms of being more mechanized. So these smallholder agriculture, especially in the more hilly areas, they may eventually die out, for all we know, unless some socioeconomic changes happen such that the land becomes more attractive. So, I mean, I've seen quite a few really, creative and what do you call it? Visionary studies looking at some of these, foresee some of these demographic, socioeconomic changes. Yeah, the short answer is yes, but I think I agree with your point that some of these big transitions that are upcoming, I think they should be looked at more and more consciously as we propose potential strategies of managing our land resources and managing conservation challenges. So one topic, like, for example, we are talking about a lot that's forward-looking is climate change. But I think in terms of forecasting land use change, forecasting how populations are going to shift, how countries may be going to, shift demographically and socioeconomically, I think more realistic scenarios, more, I don't know, well thought through scenarios need to be thought about more explicitly, maybe eventually to the same extent as when we're thinking about climate change issues.
Thank you very much. So let's go into the question from the audience. We have a question, I think it's from Christos Mamides. It's great work with important conservation implications. Many of the insights on biodiversity benefits are based on birds, as data are more readily available. I'm curious to what extent these patterns are generalizable to other taxa, or if we risk optimizing actions that will benefit birds, but not necessarily less studied ones?
That's a great question, Chris. And hi, by the way. So that's a very good point. And as you correctly pointed out, the reason why birds have been such a preferred taxa is because of their data accessibility. Now, so this figure here I showed of a 2019 study on forest fragmentation, and as you can see, actually it's multi-taxa. It's not only birds but also arthropods, herbs, and mammals. And I think, I mean, the results are generally consistent across taxa. With the caveat that species or taxa groups may be expected to respond in different ways to the same agent of land use change. Part of me also thinks that evolutionarily speaking, I don't know if there's necessarily strong reason to expect that one taxonomic group would be evolutionarily more susceptible or less susceptible to a given agent of land use change. I mean, I remain agnostic in that regard, but part of me thinks that the one reason maybe why we see so much in a lot of different contexts, why we see such contrast among taxonomic groups in how they respond, may be to do with the extent to which they have been filtered already, maybe. And also there may be some inherent traits of different taxonomic group that render them inherently, I guess, to some extent different among each other in terms of how sensitive they are. So I guess I don't have a very good answer for that in terms of the applicability of the bird-related findings. But suffice to speak that a lot of, at least some of these global scale syntheses, they actually apply to multiple taxa other than just birds. I would like to know if you have any opinions, because I think that's a really interesting question. But
yeah, Christoph, you can type your response there. So we have a question from Telina, one of our students at XTVG. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question is, does restoration consistently prioritize recreating the original habitat, or is the ultimate goal always to set up a forest? Since certain agricultural landscape, mainly livestock pasture, may come naturally from grasslands or habitats, how do we determine the most suitable restoration and goals? And restoration end goals?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, obviously my talk is very forest biased, but I guess I should have been more clear that I am using forest ecosystem as a case, because this is my area of research. But when we talk about restoration, we're not really talking about just forest restoration. We're talking about restoration of quote unquote the range of ecosystems that the Earth potentially supports. So actually, I don't know if this is very well known among the public, that when we talk about ecological restoration, and actually in the field of ecological restoration, there is a fairly clear definition of it aiming to restore. The eventual goal, if you're talking about bona fide ecological restoration, the goal would be to aim to restore native ecosystems. And that naturally would mean not only forest, but also grassland, wetland, all these other potential ecosystems, depending on the biophysical features of the site. So yeah, go ahead.
No, this seems pretty obvious, but it's surprising how many interventions don't have well-defined goals or carefully thought goals. So, and of course, defining the goals clearly, not knowing what is what we want to achieve is very important, and of course, not only for restoration.
Yeah, and I would add to that oftentimes initiatives may also suffer from having too many goals. They may say, or they may claim that we want to achieve carbon storage, timber production, soil erosion control, and biodiversity conservation, except that how you would actually aim to achieve all of them in an efficient way, in an effective way, that's entirely unclear.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We have two questions from Dosa. Nice talk, Fangyuan. I have two questions. One, why agroforestry seems to not benefit looser species? And then the second one is, if one wants to design a restoration project, do you advocate an initial assessment of winner and loser species? And if there is no loser species, then one could propose agroforestry.
Sorry, I didn't get the second one, but maybe I can answer the first one.
Okay, go ahead and I can do the second. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the first one is regarding the inability of or lack of full potential for agroforestry to benefit losers is because ultimately, if you look at the photo here, actually, this is an agroforestry from Hainan province in China. And I know there's a wide range of what agroforestry systems look like. I know that in Yunnan, for example, you have some amazing agroforestry systems where it almost looks like a forest, except that understory you have some different, not necessarily crops, but maybe some other herbs grown for economic purposes. But in landscapes like the one shown here, we don't really see it having a very kind of forest-like structure. And I think that actually represents not a small minority of agroforestry systems. And when you have a destructed or a dramatically altered vegetation structure compared to native forest ecosystems, the losers that I refer to, they may not be able to find necessary living resources like cavities for nesting, food resources, or other simply for example, microclimate needs. They may not be able to find those. So I think most likely there are ecological reasons why those species, the losers, they cannot really adapt to an altered ecosystem.
Yeah,
and if
the
that
second
answers
question is,
satisfactory, then the second question.
yeah. So the second question is, let's assume that someone wants to do a restoration project, and if they go to the site and they don't identify loser species, there are no species that fit within the syndrome of the loser species, then could one propose agroforestry as a restoration in this context?
Good question. Potentially, but I would suggest, and I would think the robust way to go with this would be to get an assessment of what the whole assemblage is in a benchmark ecosystem. And from there, you assess how well agroforestry systems are doing. And it may well turn out that in a system like Xishuangbanna or other, I don't know, more kind of, using my jargon, more filtered ecosystems, the existing species assemblage might not have that much of a requirement, maybe, but we really need to know this based on empirical data collected from the local system.
We have a question from Jenny Wu. Many thanks for the insightful presentation. I have a relatively basic question. Are there major differences between afforestation and restoration in terms of biodiversity impacts? What would you suggest to better evaluate afforestation's impact on biodiversity, for example, in land use models, apart from considering whether an area is historically forest, non-forest biome? What else should be considered? Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a very important question, actually. I should have mentioned this, but afforestation, in the true sense of the word, it means establishing forest cover where there should not have been natural forest cover. In other words, like if you think about a grassland ecosystem or China's northwest, where natural conditions just do not support the natural existence of forest cover. And when you try to plant trees there, you're talking about afforestation. So in terms of biodiversity implications of that, then you can imagine that if you establish a land cover that's not supposed to be there in the first place, then local species that rely on the initial whatever natural habitat there might have been, they would not be happy. They would probably not do very well. So that's why we see quite a few studies now showing the negative impacts of afforestation on local assemblages. And I think by and large, afforestation is not really falling into the realm of what specialists would call ecological restoration, simply because it's not aiming to provide enable the restoration or recovery of the ecosystem toward a natural baseline.
We have a question from William Patton, Bill Patton. I just want to shout out to Bill because he's the one who got us in touch with Professor Jeffrey Sachs. So thank you, Bill, for that wonderful link. So then Bill's question is, thank you for your excellent presentation. I'm curious about the effect of timeframes of deforestation on filtering, and if we have any evidence for these effects. For instance, while deforestation in China goes back thousands of years, 4,000 or 5,000, deforestation in North America, and he's a Canadian, only goes back several centuries. What is your view? Have these different timeframes resulted in big differences in filtering?
I think this is actually what I meant here by agricultural history. And as shown in this graph here, the x-axis is the time length up until now, the time, how many years have passed since the initial first occurrence of agriculture in the landscape. So we're not talking about a particular current agricultural site. We're talking about for a region as a whole. When was the first time ever that humans have set foot and started agriculture? So in that sense, a dot representing North America, several hundred years, for example, would naturally fall within the lower range of our graph here, whereas East Asia, especially including the Indian example I mentioned, that site actually happens to be the very far point of our graph here. It's over actually over 9,000 years of agricultural history. So yeah, sorry for not being more clear, but I think the point you made about timescale is actually the point of this graph here, shown here on the x-axis.
Yeah, so definitely very, very important effect of timescale, right? So then we have 3 questions from Song Liang, which I think you know well. Song Liang, he's the PI of our restoration ecology group in XTBG. He says, very impressive talk. I have 3 questions. 1, are plantations bad for all birds? Are there any winner bird species, or are there some species adapting well in restored novel ecosystems? This is one question. Maybe you can respond this first.
Yeah, of course, there are winners for mostly, I think every situation there's going to be winners. From our experience, so some of the more generalist species, like for example tits, they tend to be quite tolerant of a range of habitat types. So they would be very generally quite adaptable in terms of habitat change. And then there's another category of species with special requirements of particular habitat. So for example, there may be some species that rely on conifer species. And if you happen to put in a monoculture stand of conifer trees, that may turn out to be a very happy place for them. So yeah, the short answer is yes, there generally are. We have observed that there tend to be winner species in even very simple plantations.
And the second question is, it is definitely important to restore large expanses. Oh, is it definitely important to restore a large expanses of mature forest? But how to fulfill this quite challenging goal? Should we restore many small forest patches, or should we restore one big one?
So excellent question, and actually gets at the debate in landscape ecology, right? Single small, or single large, or multiple small, or several small, or even now we have, even just a couple of years ago, we have the vicious debate between habitat fragmentation per se, the effect of that. My sense is that, given what I wrote here, my sense is that we know that a lot of the species that benefit from small patches, they actually tend to be species that like edge habitat, that like more exposed habitat. And that's the exact opposite of what we're thinking about being destroyed when we talk about deforestation or forest degradation. So my hunch is, for the loser species, we really need extensive expanses of mature forest with a little or less edge habitat. So in that sense, I would say I would gravitate toward having a single large expanse of mature. Eventually, maybe now it's still young, but eventually you know that you have put in mechanism to allow it to regenerate over time. Now, how do you get that going? How to get that implemented? I think that's $1 million question, right? But I think in theory, if we really know the scientific guidance, and if we are serious about implementing such guidance, I think government as well as non-governmental, as well as community level efforts need to be pulled together to try to enable some kind of land use zoning. And again, going back to the first question Ahimsa asked about sharing versus sparing, I think eventually maybe it's actually a whole suite of interventions that are needed, not just one single answer. So a quick example for that is actually, even now in the UK, people are realizing there are some species that even though now they used to, at some point they were winner species because they were brought in that benefited from human deforestation. But this was hundreds of years ago, to the point that now they are actually the native species that need conservation attention because agriculture continues to be developed in a very intensive way. So people in the UK, when they talk about sharing versus sparing debate, they're now increasingly aware of the need to introduce some kind of intermediate agricultural landscape, so that those intermediate species that cannot really adapt to forest ecosystems anymore, but that also can not sustain themselves in the intensive agricultural systems, they can benefit, or they can have a place to live. So yeah, eventually, like, I think the multi-pronged approach, that's what I think.
Yeah, so as a small side comment, in the context of the rewilding debate of the last 10 years, that has been an interesting issue, protecting the winners from 200 years ago, from the traditional agriculture, and that has been a very, very hot debate in Europe. So we have Son Liang's third question. Both conservation and restoration are important topics, and we have done a lot of things on both aspects. Do you think it is possible to integrate more on conservation and restoration, and how?
Short answer, yes. I assume other considerations is outside of conservation and restoration, or specifically on the ecology side. But I think when we talk about even just conservation and restoration, there's so many other actual, like, practical considerations that must be attended to. Like, for example, financing. How do we get enough funding for conservation and restoration? Land tenure, which I alluded to already. How do we even make the land available and continue to be available? For even if we have clear scientific guidance, psychology, like how consumers are going to behave in response to campaigns of reducing their food waste or food footprint, all these things. And that's the whole reason why conservation science has now really been a term kind of replacing conservation biology, just because people realize that to effect conservation, it's so much more than just ecology. Ecological understanding is far from enough. And we need all these other interdisciplinary perspectives to be able to devise actionable solutions.
So, Fangyuan, if you're okay, we can take one more question. It's
sure.
Almost. So then the last question is from Surya, is also one of our students. He's from Indonesia. And he's saying, hi, Dr. Fangyuan. From your perspective, what is a safe haven for biodiversity and ideal forest restoration due to in the context of infrastructure development? So then has a follow-up. For example, my country, Indonesia, has many road networks inside protected areas. And roads promote the expansion of agriculture, or promote agricultural incursion inside these protected areas. So then, yeah, what will be the safe haven for biodiversity in ideal restoration in this context?
Tough question, but I think in the context you mentioned, I hear you, and it's a very real question, real problem. And actually, just a few weeks ago, there was this Nature paper, right, mapping ghost roads in Southeast Asia, showing that there's enormous amount of unmapped road not showing on map apps. And we know also, like you already mentioned, the roads are kind of the first inroads of damage when people move in, as people move in, and there's poaching, there's fire, and all these other disturbances. I don't know I have a good answer to that. I mean, the obvious, I guess, textbook answer would be to try to address those threats. And again, this would require mobilization of policy tools, of NGOs work, non-governmental work, and community engagement, all these other things. But I think, at least in terms of roads, we have a fairly clear understanding of how damaging they are to biodiversity, even if in supposed protected areas. And with the scientific, insights so clear, I think what to do in terms of maybe some measures of blocking the road, or I don't know. Again, these interventions or solutions will have to be thought about under the context of all these other constraints to conservation, right? But I think, at least in terms of ecology, it provides the direction toward which we should aim to achieve if we were to benefit some of these species that are at the most risk of extinction, of population declines. We kind of know what to do. It's just about finding ways that are actionable, that are pragmatic, and that are, I mean, I think it's also important to think about equity, that are equitable to make efforts or progress towards the direction that we already know. So I don't know I really answered your question, but point well taken.
Well, I think it's a very complex issue. I think probably the biology or the ecology part is the easier side of it. The the social aspect of it, as what you tend to do Songliang, that is much more difficult to do and to implement. So maybe we can have one day one follow-up discussion on the implementation, and with come things like international cooperation. You were showing the map of where agriculture expansion is expected. It's going to be in Africa, and then it's with the places where we could optimize agriculture is not where agriculture is going to be expanded, and of course that would require countries to collaborate and to do conservation-centric trade or planning, which it is going to be very difficult, but it will be a very interesting discussion to have.
Yeah, agreed. Fully agreed.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we will keep it here. Thank you very much. Fangyuan has been a really interesting and useful presentation and a very, very exciting discussion. So then before we say goodbye, I wanna just remind the audience that we will have a special webinar on Tuesday, 21st of May, 9 a.m. Beijing time, with Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University. Is one of the most influential development economists, and in terms of sustainability, I think has been one of the key people in this century. And then we'll have also a very good webinar on the 4th of June with Professor Bill Sutherland, which I think is also one of the heavyweights in conservation in the last few decades. So I hope to see you all on these webinars. And again, Fangyuan, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.